Sick of winter. I know some of you love it, but a couple of you, I know you're getting sick of it. Not me. I was fine until I made the mistake this week of looking through some old family photos. You know where half those photos were from? The beach or the pool. And I was like, all right, I'm ready. I'm ready to be outdoors again. But looking at some of those photos of the kids when they were even just a couple years younger at the pool just brought back this flood of memories. Maybe you have kids or grandkids, and you've seen them through that phase where they're jumping into your arms in the pool. And there's this just like adorable interaction between the parent and the child as the child tries to get up the courage and the trust in the parent to actually jump into their arms into the pool. And this interaction with the parents kind of urging them in. And they're saying, come on, I'm right here. Daddy will catch you. Come and jump in. The kids are like, oh. They're doing that dance like they want to go. They're not quite sure in that trust. And the parents are like, come and jump in. And it's this like great interaction of growth as the child builds up that courage and the parent urges the child to trust them. And I bring that up this morning because there's a similar relationship between us and our Heavenly Father, the God of the universe. That we are a people who are constantly having to just jump. We're having to jump into the waters, trusting God is going to catch us. I don't know if you've had to make a jump lately. A lot of people have been struggling this last year with fear, or similarly, maybe just with anger, which is kind of like fear, but with the self-defense mechanism ramped up to full speed. Some people are having big challenges before them, big decisions to make, and they're going to have to leap and trust that God will catch them as they make that big decision. And for some, it's just navigating some difficult relationships that are difficult to navigate right now. And they're having to trust the Lord to offer someone grace, not knowing how it will turn out, but trusting that God will protect their hearts and minds for the future. And as we're doing that, many times the picture we have in our heads is that it is all up to us to just trust God and just leap into his arms as if he isn't doing what the parent does in the pool. And I'm here this morning to tell you that just as the parent is urging their child to make that leap of faith into the waters, to plunge into these waters and trust that the parent is going to catch them, in the same way, God is urging us to come and trust him. He is active in his encouragement of us to follow and trust in him. He is not passive and distant, simply just testing whether we will trust him or not. If we would open our eyes daily, we would see the Lord urging us to follow him. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Technically, how God leads us. But I think more accurately, how God helps us follow him. Because he is a God of grace and mercy, as he seeks us to trust him, to glorify himself, and actually for our good. We're going to see that in Joshua chapters 3 and 4. We're going to see two ways that God helps us follow him wherever he might go, and then a response that we can make to help us follow wherever he may lead us. I'm going to read some of Joshua chapter 3 again, even though I read it already early in the service, but I want you to hear it again with fresh ears as we see how God helps his people as they're coming into the land to do an impossible task to take this land from hostile forces. Yet God is encouraging them along the way. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out to Shittim. And they came to the Jordan, and he and all the people of Israel and lodged there before they passed over. And at the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, as soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it of about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. Then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourself, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And we'll talk more about consecrating ourselves the next time we're in Joshua after Missions Emphasis Week. Joshua said to the priests, "Take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on before the people." And so they took up the Ark of the Covenant and went out before the people. And here's the first thing we see here, that God goes before his people. That God goes before his people. A huge emphasis in this part and the rest of the passage as God parts the Jordan and allows them to cross over on dry land is that the ark is in front of the people. And we need to remember what the ark represents for the people of God. It represents God's presence. If we went back to Exodus and looked over the instructions that the Lord gave to the Israelites, and in particular to Moses, of how to assemble this Ark of the Covenant, he told them, make it very carefully. You're going to put the 10 Commandments and the testimony of your time with me up here, Moses, in there so the people might remember it, as well as a few other items over time. And on top is going to go this golden mercy seat. And he says, there is where I will meet you. And the ark would sit in the tabernacle, that portable version of the temple that they used to worship God in those days, in the most holy place, with the holy place outside and then the courtyard outside of that. And that God would manifest his presence in a special way there, in a particular way there, at the ark, so that when the people offered their sacrifices, they had this assurance that, yes, the Lord is pleased with this sacrifice. He is a Lord who is graceful in forgiving my sins, or we are just showing glory to him, or whatever that sacrifice would be. Well, now the ark is on the move, but the idea of the ark is the same. It's a representation of God's presence with Israel, and so it is the first thing to go into the waters, showing the people of Israel how they should go, showing them that God is before them. And we saw in the text that they're to keep a distance of 2,000 cubits. That's like half a mile. It's pretty far. And some commentators will look at this and say, well, the ark is holy, and the Lord is holy and set apart, and his holiness is dangerous. And so, they need to make sure they are pure and keep a distance from the ark. But I don't think that's what's happening here, because the text says that they are to do this in order that they may see where God is going, because they haven't gone this way before. That's true both physically. They haven't been in this part of the land before and crossed over the Jordan yet, the majority of them. But it's also true just as a metaphor for the people to see that they have been wandering in the wilderness all these years, learning to trust God, and now they're going to have to put it into action as they head into the land. This is the key point for us, that God goes before us. That God goes before us. Whatever we are facing, whatever challenges in front of us, whether we might be crippled by fear or anxiety or anger, whatever it might be, the Lord is already there. And we are just to follow him. I think sometimes we forget that. It's hard for us sometimes, I think, to imagine a God who is all-powerful, who is almighty, who knows everything, who knows the very challenge that we are to face before we face it. You know what it's like? It's like the crew of the Secret Service that heads out before the President of the United States travels somewhere. Whenever the President of the United States makes a planned visit somewhere, the amount of logistics that goes into his visit is mind-boggling. Dozens of agents show up, sometimes more than a month ahead of time, to start working with local agencies, spot out different routes the president will take on his visit, come up with some backup routes, escape routes, all the ways that this trip could go and go wrong. They're there planning ahead for it. And then just days before the president gets there, they fly in a giant C-17. These planes are huge. When you see, I used to live near an Air Force base. When these planes fly overhead, they are so big, you're like, how are they floating? It doesn't even look like they're moving. They're so big. It's amazing. And they literally pack multiple versions of the president's car, which they call the Beast, ahead of time. So it's waiting for him when he gets there. And then when he does get there, they have all these local agencies for protection. They have motorcycle cops, dozens of them. They have traffic. It's mind-boggling how much effort goes in before a presidential visit. And as impressive as that is, and as impressive as the Secret Service is, the Lord God, maker of heavens and earth, has a much more thorough ahead of time plan for you than the Secret Service does for the President of the United States. And so we need to remember that. God goes before us. He is preparing us for whatever future we have, and he already knows what is going to happen when we get here, and is encouraging us to follow him. And we just need eyes to see and remember, yes, God is leading me. I can move forward as long as I am following him, just the way he went before the Israelites with the Ark of the Covenant to say, look, you can follow me. But that's not the only way that God encourages his people in this passage to go and do the impossible task that they have before them. Chapter 3 again, starting at verse 7. The Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you, he says to Joshua. And as for you, command the priests who bear the Ark of the Covenant, when you come to the brink of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. And the people said, and Joshua said to the people of Israel, come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. And Joshua said, here is how you shall know that the living God is among you. And he will without fail drive out before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. Say that 10 times fast. I practiced that in the mirror 3 times this morning. But that they would be able to go in this land and take them from these peoples that want to see Israel wiped from the map. Verse 11, behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is passing over before you into the Jordan. Now therefore, take 12 men from the tribes of Israel, from each tribe a man, and when the soles of the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan shall cut off from flowing, and the waters coming down from above shall stand still in one heap. And so when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan with the priests bearing the ark of the covenant before the people, and as soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water, now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest, the waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan. And those flowing down from the sea of Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off. And the people passed over opposite Jericho. And now the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And all Israel was passing over on dry ground until the nation finished passing over the Jordan. And here's what we see next. That God encourages us forward by demonstrating his faithfulness. That God encourages us forward by demonstrating his faithfulness. God had already parted the Red Sea. Did he have to part the Jordan for them to cross? Would it have been an impossible task? It would not have been impossible. It would have been a disaster. And actually, the Lord shows his power once again in the timing of this event. The narrative as I read it about them going up to the waters and putting their feet in, and now we're ready for them to tell us that the water stopped just like they did at the Red Sea. And it interrupts and it says, now, listen, all the waters overflow during the time of the harvest. And actually, that's really important to know. Because if you go to Israel, and I went to Israel, and you see the Jordan, you might be picturing something mighty and powerful. No, it's this like muddy little stream. Like most places, it's only really as wide as kind of from here, maybe to the back wall here. Most of it is not above your head. We imagine like the Susquehanna or like something like carving out through the mountains, and it's not that. But during the harvest, it is a mess. Sometimes the floodplain surrounding it could be a mile long in some places. Some places just several hundred feet. And the thing about living in an arid climate and there being a small river going through it is around that small river, this like jungle pops up along the river. And so trying to wade through that thicket with the waters flooded would have been a mess. And God showed his power to them, particularly by picking this time for them to cross over. But God is not doing it just to help his people over. I believe he is doing it to once again encourage them to trust him, to remind them of what he did at the Red Sea when he parted it to deliver his people from Egypt, reminding them that he will deliver them again, showing them if I can part these waters of the Jordan, then I can help deliver this land into your hands. And I am just amazed as I read chapter 3 here at God's grace and patience with the people of Israel, because he knew they needed this encouragement. Because if you've read through this narrative, the people of Israel have not always been super faithful. Despite what miraculous thing God does, doubt often seeps into their minds. I mean, the reason that they were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years and have had to wait to enter the land is because they were not ready to trust the Lord. But you know what? I look back at all the things that God has done for them and say, well, listen, if he had just parted the Red Sea for them, that should have been enough. Or if he had just given them manna when they were out in the desert, that should have been enough. And if he had just given them water when they were thirsty in miraculous ways in the desert, that should be enough. If he should have given them deliverance from enemies who would attack them in that wilderness, that would have been enough. Or when he led them into the land and protected the spies that went in Joshua chapter 2 that we talked about last week, that would have been enough. Or if he had just parted the Jordan for them, that should have been enough. And yet God continues over and over and over again throughout this narrative and into the future of the book, encouraging his people forward, showing them his might, reminding them over and over again of his goodness. The Lord should not have had to show them 100 times that he can do the impossible, but he does anyway. And that should be an encouragement to us, that God, even though he's shown his faithfulness in the past, will continue showing his faithfulness to us going forward. And we have to open our eyes to see it. That when God does an amazing thing, to pay attention to what he is doing. Because he is not only blessing us for that day, but he is also using the blessing of that day to move us forward. Let me tell you how I've seen this work out in my own life. When Cheryl and I first moved to Massachusetts, let me back up one step. So Cheryl and I got married, and we had to move somewhere together because we were living separately from one another. And when we went to move, I had found a job in Massachusetts, so I moved there. And Cheryl, when we got married, was going to have to move in with me too, and move to Massachusetts with me and try to find a teaching job. The problem was, it was 2008. And in 2008, the economy collapsed, and school districts were laying off teachers. And yet, despite them having hundreds of resumes at this one school district, Cheryl ended up getting a teaching job, not in Massachusetts, but just over the border in Connecticut. And we were praising God, and we were so thankful for what he had done. But listen, God didn't just do that for us to encourage us in that moment. He was encouraging us for the future. Because several years later, when we were deciding to go to seminary, we knew we'd have to move across country to Dallas to go to Dallas Theological Seminary. And when we went to do that, guess what Dallas was doing? Laying off teachers. And so this amazing thing that God had done in our past gave us courage in that day to move to Dallas, not knowing what kind of jobs Cheryl could get or that I could get, since they had kind of a delay reaction to 2008. But God's past faithfulness encouraged us into the future. And so when God does something for you, he's not just saying, hey, look what I could do for you today. He's saying, remember this. I'm going to lead you into the future. Which brings me to my next point. Let's read chapter 4. Because God is in here going to show us the importance of our response to the things he is doing. Both his leading of us and going before us, but also that reminder of the amazing things he's doing. Let's read. Verse 1, when all the nation had passed over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, take 12 stones from here, out in the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight. And then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, pass on before the ark and the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of tribes of the people of Israel, that this might be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off, so these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. And the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, just as the Lord had told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to the place where they lodged and laid them down there. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the covenant had stood. And they are there to this day. For the priests bearing the ark stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished, that the Lord commanded Joshua to tell the people according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. And people passed over in haste. And when all the people had finished passing over, the ark of the Lord and the priests passed over with the people. And the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh passed over armed before the people of Israel as Moses had told them. That little note there, you may remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about these 2.5 tribes that didn't have to go over. They, in a sense, they already had the land that the Lord had given them, but because they were supposed to act as the people of Israel together, they were to still send their warriors and their people over with the rest of Israel because they were a community going through this together, even though they had their inheritance already. About 40,000, it says in verse 13, about 40,000 ready for battle passed over the plains of Jericho. And on that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him, just as they had stood in awe of Moses all the day of his life. And the Lord said to Joshua, command the priests bearing the ark of the testimony to come up out of the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests, come up out of the Jordan. And when the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord came up from the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet were lifted up on dry ground, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all its banks as before. And the people came up out of Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. And they camped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones, which they took from the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until it passed over. And the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and that you may fear the Lord your God forever. Here's the point for us. Remember what God has done to propel you forward. Remember what God has done to propel you forward. We expect when all the people of Israel crossed over on dry land that they would come out of it and God would let the waters back down. But that's not what happened. The Ark of the Covenant and the 12 representatives of all the tribes stayed, in the middle of the Jordan, kind of keeping it dry while they kind of performed this ceremony. And they built a little monument. These were going to be bigger stones. They would stick out of the water. These 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel, to stack them up so people would remember what God did. So that when, Grandpa took his grandkids to, Gilgash National Park or Gilgal National Park in the future, and they were walking around, there's all these stones sticking out of the ground. And the child would ask, hey, why are these stones all stacked up like this? Be like, hey, listen, this is what the Lord did for us then. And what's the purpose of all this? It says right at the end there, that you may fear the Lord your God forever into the future. We need to remember what God has done if we're going to be propelled into the future he has for us. And as humans, we are just not good at remembering. It's very easy for us to slowly let things slip from our minds and fade away. I mean, I don't know if this has happened to you, but it sometimes happens with close friends. We have a close friend. They're so meaningful to us in that moment, but our lives change and we get into a little bit touch with them a little less, and we kind of stop talking a little less until finally we haven't talked to them for a long, long time. And then you see that friend again, maybe after years, and it all comes flooding back to you. And remember how important this person was to our life. The same kind of thing with the Lord. We want to be constantly remembering what he has done for us if we're going to be able to trust him to go forward into the future. And so we need to be a people who are finding ways to remember God. And this is your homework this week. How will you remember the great things that God has done in the same way that Joshua had the people of Israel remember what God had done by placing these stones? Reach under your pews. Just kidding, don't actually do that. I didn't put stones under there because the stones are not the point. I mean, we could have done that. We could have given everyone a stone of remembrance to remember something great that God had done. But I don't want this to just be a one Sunday thing. I want you to find for you what helps you remember the great things that God has done in the past. And there's a lot of ways to do this, but you need to find something that is going to work for you. One way is simply telling others. Simply telling others what God has done helps remind us, or if we forget, our good friends or our family will then remind us what God has done, only if we tell them about it. I witnessed this week. My sister-in-law, Cheryl's sister, Lisa, lives in Houston, Texas. And so you could imagine what the past few weeks for her have been like if you've been following the news at all, as they've had a terrible winter storm, worse than any that we've seen, extremely low temperatures, and no way to deal with it. She lost power for a week. She had to stay with a friend. And then when they got back home, no one could turn on their water because everyone had at least one pipe that was cracked because they don't insulate, their house the same way we do. And they don't insulate their pipes. And that's what happened to her. There was only one pipe, but they couldn't turn on their water. So here they are, power back on. They're home. They still can't take a shower because they can't turn the water back on. As you could imagine, plumbers were fairly busy. She called up and got all the plumbers' list and was starting to kind of despair, saying, is it going to be weeks before I get my water back in my own house? When someone told her about another plumber who was right in her neighborhood. So she gave him a call thinking, okay, I'm just going to be added to this guy's list now, and maybe I'll get lucky sometime in the next week or so. And he picked up, which was really unusual. I heard that some of the plumbers there, and this is Lisa who said this is not just the news, she was told some of the plumbers were receiving 500 requests a day for service. I don't even know how many places they could visit, even if they just stayed in one neighborhood. But anyway, this plumber picked up, and he says, I would love to help. I know I'm not on all the lists. He was just an apprentice, so he wasn't on all the lists that everyone was calling. But he's like, I'm out of supplies. Sorry. Well, half an hour later, he calls Lisa back. He's like, hey, my buddy for Louisiana said he would drive his truck here and bring a bunch of plumbing supplies. He should be here by the evening. I'll be over then. And he came over and he fixed her one pipe that needed fixing. And my sister-in-law was just praising the Lord and did so online. She actually made this Facebook post about it. And Lisa isn't one. She uses Facebook basically to post pictures of her kids so the grandparents could see them. She doesn't really engage on Facebook much, but she did say this. She says, community, that is what gets us through tough times. I'm absolutely humbled at the help and support of friends and family have given us this past week. We were one of the fortunate ones to get our water back on this evening. I look around at all the things that I forgot were actual blessings. God has a way of showing us that it's not just about getting through hard situations. It's about how we deal with it and what we learn from it. Simple. She didn't give us a sermon. She glorified God with what she had seen. And she felt like God was all over their situation in those last few weeks. It was a simple little thing, but it will live on Facebook forever. And she'll be reminded by her friends or by Facebook itself someday in the future of God's faithfulness in the past, and it will help her move forward. By the way, side note, if you were here for last week, this is also a great illustration of what we talked about last week, letting people around us know about the mighty things God has done in our life. There you go, side note. Okay, back to this week. So that's one way. Tell other people. Another way, maybe the stones is the way to go for you. Maybe some kind of physical reminder of what God has done in your past will help propel you forward. I know that's something I've done in the past. Right here is a plaque that I've kept that was sitting on a doorway in Plano, Texas, when I was down there in seminary. It says Shane Samolin Worship Ministries. And it was just my door plaque when I was a worship leader at a church down in Texas. And I remember the day walking in there when they had hired me and walking up to that door, remembering not being a believer just a few years ago, remembering having a different career just a few years before that, and walking and seeing that not only a church was inviting me to the awesome responsibility of leading their people in worship. They thought that was so important that I do that they were paying me to do it. And I didn't have to work another job to support my family. It was just this amazing moment, and it just blew me away in the moment. And I'm like, I want to remember this. I remember how God has carried me along throughout times. And so I keep things like this, and it wasn't hard for me to find, to remind me of God's faithfulness in the past. There's lots of other things you can do. Some people like prayer journals. Some people find what works for you. Because the fact is, the Lord goes before you. And the fact is, the Lord is consistently, because of his grace and mercy, showing us amazing things so that we might trust him not only in that moment, but in the future. And all we have to do in those days of trouble or stress or whatever it is remember God's faithfulness that he has already shown us. And it will give us the ability to follow him into the future. One last point. I know I went a little long this morning. But before we close, I told you about that image of kind of the child jumping into the parent's arms into the pool. I have a slightly different version of that story. When I was growing up, my dad and I had a pretty good relationship. I had a lot of trust in him, and he knew me really well. And one day he asked me, as we were at the pool at the Lions Club pool in New Britain, Connecticut, if any of you care. Hey, do you know what to do if you were to fall in or jump into the deep end and like mommy and daddy weren't there to help you? I was like, I don't know. He's like, all right, well, let's go check it out. So he carried me into the deep end of the pool and kind of held me, and we were right in the center of it. And it wasn't that deep, but it was over my head, certainly not over his head. And he kind of held me there, and he's like, listen, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to drop you in. And I'm going to see what you do. And so just try to figure out a way to get back up. And I'm right here. I'll grab you if you're down there too long. Let's just give you just to try it. And over time, my dad had built up enough trust with me that I was like, okay. And I did it. And he let me go. And I figured out I could bounce up from the bottom. And he finally, after a couple bounces and taking breaths, he grabbed me. Hey, that was great. That's exactly what you should do. But that kind of trust didn't happen overnight. And don't tell my mother this. But I don't know if it would have been the same with her, right? When it came to swimming, I just developed this special bond with him and trusted him. And I remembered the ways he had been faithful in the past. And so when it was time for me to sink or swim, I trusted him to do it. It's the same idea with our perfect Heavenly Father. Remember what he has done in the past, and it'll help you move forward trusting him in the future. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do not deserve